Welcome to the second day of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, 29th Annual Arab-U.S. Policymakers Conference. As mentioned yesterday, we have these events annually. It's the only one in the world, to our knowledge, for public and private sector. And it began having to do with the country from which the Secretary General at the present time of the Gulf Cooperation Council hails, namely Kuwait. And indeed, the GCC's first Secretary General was from Kuwait, in terms of Abdullah Yaqub Bishara, who held that 3-year post, 4 consecutive times for a total of 12 years. It has been my distinct honor, privilege, and pleasure to have been invited to attend as an observer, Rasmi official observer, to each and every one of the GCC's ministerial and heads of state summits since the organization's founding in 1981. It is the most successful of all of the Arab sub-regional attempts at cooperation between and amongst member countries. The only larger one on the same principle, but also older, is the League of Arab States in Cairo, which represents 22 and separate and independent Arab entities. And we want the listeners and the viewers who are generalists but not specialists to not confuse Arabs with Islam or Islam with Arabs. Yes, indeed, overwhelming millions, hundreds of millions of Muslims are Arabs. But the majority of Muslims are not Arabs. They come from countries like Pakistan and Indonesia, and even in India, more than 100 million Muslims there. And 100 million Muslims in India is greater than the entire population of the 6 GCC countries that His Excellency Nayef Al-Hajraf will be addressing. This particular experiment in regional cooperation gets mixed reviews in the Western media and perhaps Eastern as well, especially since the so-called rift of the last several years between 3 of the GCC countries and a 4th one, namely Qatar. But Kuwait is not part of that. Neither is Oman part of that. But because people have looked at it from a geopolitical perspective, this has been misleading in terms of what the GCC is, has been, was, and is continuing to be to this very moment. The number of standing councils within the GCC that are tasked at a ministerial level to further the pace, the progress, the nature, the extent of modernization and development across the board among all 6 GCC countries to enhance their cooperation and their coordination. Now, His Excellency comes to this task ideally situated and suited for this kind of task of the GCC. And it's helpful to be reminding that during the Cold War, which pitted much of the West against the Soviet Union and China as well, the United Nations did not cease its activities, either at the utmost level of the Security Council or the General Assembly or its standing subunits and agencies and authorities. And so the Secretary General is the #1 person of the 6 GCC countries to manage these kinds of dynamics. And what better preparation, education, and training for such a position can one hope to possibly emulate or imagine. In Western terms, he would be part of what some derisively refer to as the deep state. That is to say, that body of unknown, often underappreciated element of a society that is engaged in civil service. And this individual has been the former Minister of Finance in Kuwait, and prior to that as well, the Minister of Education and the Minister of Higher Education, as well as the chairman or a director or prominent member of numerous Kuwaiti management and governing bodies. And when one mentions how ideally situated His Excellency is for this position, one needs to take note of what some people may think are typographical errors. Can one imagine that Kuwait was engaged in foreign economic assistance 7 years before it became fully nationally sovereign, politically independent, and territorially intact? These are the three criteria for membership and entry into the United Nations. Kuwait has, throughout this long period, and that began in the mid-1950s, it obtained its independence in 1961, and its elections national from then to the present, beginning in 1963, with its constitution, which is the oldest of the 6 GCC countries by far. Kuwait has been #1 in the world with regard to charity and philanthropy as a percentage of its annual gross national domestic product with regard to its goods and services, as well as its investments. No other country of the 193 members of the United Nations can boast anywhere near a record of accomplishments such as that. And beyond that, as a percentage of a country's GDP, GNP, Kuwaitis are the world's most generous people in terms of income per capita. People are unaware that the United States has a self-image that it's #1 in this regard. No, the United States is down, the last time I checked, around number 17 of the world. Kuwait remains in the top echelon, always either #1, #2, number less than #3 in these categories. His Excellency received his undergraduate education at Kuwait University, his master's at Urbana, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and his doctoral PhD at the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. There's an academic side and an empirical as well as practical and theoretical dimension to the man's education background and training, and that is he taught for 7 years at the Arab Gulf University as a professor of science and technology. These kinds of activities reflect a person in whom those who have appointed him to these positions as an individual of great character, accomplishment, achievement, and trust, especially trust. And given Kuwait's situation in an often troubled neighborhood and being smaller than most of its neighbors, it has survived in large measure because of good people of good standing who have merited the trust of those who have appointed him. We're pleased and honored to have His Excellency, the Secretary General, Nayef Al-Hajraf, Dr. Nayef Al-Hajraf, to be with us this morning and speak on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council of Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Today also, by the way, is Oman's National Day, and we wanted people to be aware of that. And the passing a year ago, almost, just less than a year ago, of His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said bin Tamer Al Said, Allah Yarhamu. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, and I'm very pleased to be among the speakers for today's sessions. And before I start, I just would like to pay a tribute to two pillars of the GCC who we missed during the 2020. In January, the late Sultan of Oman, Sultan Qaboos, and last month, the late Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah, both of whom were let's say, the articulated engineers behind the establishment of the GCC, among with the late head of states who gathered in 1981 to sign the establishment of the GCC, in which today we are marking the 4th decade and just about to embark on the 5th decade of the GCC journey. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening from the GCC Secretariat in Riyadh, and I guess it is good morning, Washington time. Let me start by thanking Dr. John Duke Anthony and the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations for organizing this conference virtually this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It gives me great pleasure to speak for the first time at the 29th Arab-U.S. Policymaker Conference in light of 2020, a year which we all will remember for so many years to come, and probably for so many reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, from Riyadh, where the G20 summit is only a few days away, in which the world is witnessing the effort Saudi Arabia has displayed during its G20 presidency, reflecting its visionary leadership in light of COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. To Washington, D.C., where the world is still waiting for the elections dust to settle and for the constitutional procedures to begin in a preparation for January 20th, 2021. Despite the distance, the relation between the US and the Arab world is historical, and it should be driven by mutual interests for both sides. Although it has its ups and downs, we are always looking for a relation built on trust, respect, and serving our mutual interests. As the GCC Secretary General, I would like to take the opportunity today to emphasize on 3 main points. 1, the GCC over the last 4 decades. 2, the 5th decade challenges. And 3, the GCC-US relations. Then I will conclude by a friendly message to the new incoming administration, to the White House. First, the GCC over the last 40 years. In May 25th of 1981, the GCC was established by its 6 member states, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, forming a cooperation framework to address the mutual and regional security and prosperity, and to enhance the brotherly relation between the member states and its people. Over the last 40 years, the GCC has shown a great ability to deal with challenges and threats, as well as maintaining a stabilizer role in the region and the world security and stability. from the Iraq-Iran war to the invasion of Kuwait, from the Afghan war to what's called the Arab Spring, the longest-standing Palestine-Israel conflict, the aftermath of 9/11. Despite all these challenges and more, the GCC remains resilient and maintains its constructive role within the international community for maximum cooperation and an advocate for peace, dialogue, and prosperity. Over the last 40 years, the GCC contributed greatly to the world economy, not only by maintaining undisrupted supply of energy, but also by stabilizing the world energy market. Over the last 40 years, the GCC's Sovereign Wealth Fund demonstrates a stable investment policy in the global capital markets and they play an important role in the world economy. Over the last 40 years, the GCC countries launched a massive development plans focusing on human capital as well as major infrastructure development in a transformation journey that is next to none. Over the last 40 years, the GCC fulfilled its commitment within the international community to combat terrorism and extremism ideology, fight poverty, helping countries in need, and became a voice of integration and harmony. As a result, the GCC countries are well positioned in global development indices, a well-deserved positions leading to Saudi Arabia presidency of G20, Dubai and UAE to host Expo 2020, and Qatar to host FIFA World Cup in 2022. All of which are an international events, and all of which are hosted by a GCC member state. Ladies and gentlemen, my second point today is the GCC fifth decade challenges. Security and stability in the region will remain a top priority to protect our interests first and foremost, so we can continue building on what we have achieved over the last 40 years. Everyone knows that the world after COVID-19 will be totally different than the world before. The biggest challenge will be the economic consequences of the pandemic. We have seen the world economy shrinking, the supply chain disrupted, the employment rate climbing, small and medium enterprises badly affected, the world economy growth swinging, yet the global economy outlook remains uncertain. It is the greatest economic challenge we are all facing that requires collective effort to address and a great deal of cooperation to mitigate. Yesterday, for example, China signed a huge Asian-Pacific trade deal with 14 countries, representing about 30% of the world population, with a combined GDP total roughly $26 trillion, accounted for nearly 28% of global trade. That's based on 2019 data. Although the negotiation lasted for more than 10 years to be finalized, it is an example of how the world will act to meet the post-COVID-19 era challenges. And we might see a similar deal to come. For the GCC, we will continue to diversify the economy to meet the COVID-19 urgent financial needs and to follow up on the implementations of stimulus programs for the most affected sector. At the same time, we are working to strengthen our economic cooperation throughout a number of FTAs with other countries, an effort which is very much needed to enhance and serve our mutual interests. Having said that, we should not undermine the prerequisites for artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolutions, and the renewable energy, while meeting our development plans objectives. For the next 10 years, which will mark the 5th decade of the GCC, many national development plans within the GCC member states will be ongoing, i.e. Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia, Vision 2035 of Kuwait, just to name a few. A common objective will be seen as the roadmap for the 5th decade, highlighting economy integration, human capital development, and maintaining our collective security and prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, my third point today is related to this conference title, the next U.S. presidency, implication for the U.S.-Arab relationship. I cannot agree more with the organizer who did so by choosing this title, as we are looking for the next weeks to understand the direction of the new administration policy regarding the Arab world as well as the greater Middle East region. President-elect Joe Biden is a statesman who knows the international policy, as well as who articulates some of its objectives and dimensions. The GCC, and since its establishment, dealt with 6 US presidents to date, both Republicans and Democratic. Based on a long-standing trusted relation and mutual understanding, both GCC and US worked closely, either bilaterally or multilaterally, to enhance the existing cooperation. Such work was reflected by the participations and attendance of 2 US presidents at the GCC summit. President Obama in May 2015 at Camp David, and April 2016 in Riyadh, and President Trump in May 2017 in Riyadh. The US-GCC relation is based on mutual trust, mutual understanding, and mutual objectives to maintain peace and prosperity in the region and globally. Respecting the international law, the UN Charter, and engaging constructively with the international community is the key factors for such a relation. The region and its people have enough crises, from Iraq to Syria, from Yemen to Lebanon. At the same time, we have seen some regional countries' interference in the internal affairs of the GCC and Arab countries, which represent a direct threat to the regional stability and security. Based on that, we are looking forward to work with the new administration, hoping to stabilize the region by de-escalate the tensions and to focus on the following. 1, the Palestine-Israel long-standing conflict, which required the full implementation of the UN resolutions, especially the 2-state solutions and the Arab Peace Initiative, with East Jerusalem as the Palestine state capital. 2, the Iran nuclear deal, known as JCPOA of 2015, in which the president-elect stated that he would rejoin it. We hope that any new regional security articulate should take in consideration the interest of all in order to meet the desired stability in the region. 3, the collective opportunities within the region to enhance the world economy, to develop a strategic economic agenda for the region to meet the youth demand for better life and better future for all. 4, and finally, COVID-19 has shown us how fragile we are if we decided to work alone. However, history has shown us how powerful we became if we decided to work together. So let's work together for a better world. To conclude, I would like to take the opportunity of today's conference to emphasize on the role the US is playing as the core of the world security and stability. It is a role no other country can fulfill. Yet,
We're not another schedule. I got the next couple of them actually for today and tomorrow.
Yet, it is a role that requires a strategic partners and alliance. Withdrawing from the region will create a state of mistrust and will destabilize the region and the world. So my friendly message to the new administration at the White House is simple and straightforward. Let's capitalize on our mutual interests. Let's work together for the security and prosperity for the region and beyond. And let's give people in conflict zones a hope for a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. This is a superb introduction to the annual Arab-U.S. Policymakers Conference. We couldn't have asked for a more authentic presentation or presenter of the issues, of the challenges, of each other's needs, each other's concerns, each other's interests, each other's analyses, each other's assessments, and each other's goals and objectives. One could not go to a more authentic source and resource to ask these kinds of questions and to examine the responses, the replies, the answers. There are no easy answers, and in some cases, no answers that are anything less than difficult and keep people awake at night. We try to have policymakers think of the W questions. Who needs to do this? Why does it need to be done? When does it need to be done? Where will we be if we do it? Where will we be if we don't do it? And sometimes even whether something needs to be done. If it's not broken, wisdom says don't try to fix it as such. But the greater questions are those that start with an H. How? You cannot answer a how question, yes or no. And for policymakers, the effort to try to come up with an intelligent, insightful, knowledgeable, understanding, informed opinion and analysis. This is priceless. We went to the top to try to get the highest GCC institutional representative to address these how questions and the W questions at the same time. And that you have set forth your needs, your interests, your priorities, your goals and objectives. We couldn't have asked for more, sir. Thank you, and God bless you in your assignment and role, and in the forthcoming annual ministerial and heads of state summit. My personal regards, those of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, the Majlis al-Watani al-Qatar Amriki, to you, to your staff, to your colleagues, both in Riyadh as well as in Kuwait. And we certainly miss the passing of your great former head of state, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Sabah, Allah Yahmud. He was more than a statesman. He was the chairman of all the world's foreign ministers for not a few months or a few years, but for decades. We've lost a giant. But with people like you to carry on, fidel, or in the shadows, so to speak, working to make things possible, one could not ask for more in that regard as well. So our renewed awareness of your position, your role, your responsibilities, and our appreciation for the wisdom of those who selected you based on your character, your education, your training, your experience, and above all, your trust. Thank you, Your Excellency, and all the best to you and your colleagues.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.